Thank you very much, everybody. It's kind of a late addition to the schedule. I'm going to talk about something that, in the context of more the philosophy of like how do we look at things. So I'm going to talk about something I came across with called the Four Eyes framework, and it's not so much a framework as it is a heuristic that I think is useful for us to think broader about the problems of security. And I like to open with a quote. This was the opening quote from Moneyball, the movie, right? Which is, I'm trying to get us to understand exactly what game we're playing here. And I like to think that we're not playing the game we think we are. And I just want to broaden the perspective a little bit. So security is important. So security is important. And why isn't it working? We've been at this for 30 years or more, right? So is it working? Well, the usual bit about myself, I'm currently an industry analyst at 451 Research. This work is completely independent of that. Prior to that, I've been a sales engineer. I've been in ops. I've been in architecture. I've been in security for way too long. The gray hair comes from a degree in comp sci in '94. And I am curious to a fault in the sense that I'm interested in different topics, finance, economics, data science, name your pick. And I had the privilege of presenting here back in 2017, the first edition. So thank you very much for being part of this. I bring some of the inspiration from this movie. Who hasn't seen The Untouchables? Right. Yeah. So, famous movie about how Al Capone was brought down by the FBI, and what brought them down was not, as you may recall, it was not the crimes that he was doing. It was the accounting behind it, right? So I'm trying to grasp at economics, or I'm trying to grasp at security from an economics angle, if you will. And I've been interested in behavior economics forever, and part of my talk here in 2017 was on economics, and I know some of you from that. Kelly does fantastic work on the topic. And where I got to this Four Eyes framework was, if you think about the broader topic of where economics fits, or how do you learn about behavior economics? There's Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, Nudge by Richard Thaler. I mean, he just won the Nobel Prize on economics. Theoretically not a Nobel, but we can discuss that later. And Dan Ariely does fantastic work in terms of popularizing the concepts around behavior economics. But as you search online, I came across this organization called clearerthinking.org. I'm not sure if any of you here are familiar. So this was it's an entrepreneur in New York City. His name is Spencer Greenberg. And I really enjoy the material that he put together. So he calls it a framework. I think it's a little too ambitious to call it a framework. It's more like a heuristic. But his theory, or his proposition, is take any existing problem in the world. Why haven't we solved it yet? Right? I mean, it's not, if you're going to, in the context of entrepreneurship, you're going to do a startup in clean energy, for example. Why haven't we solved clean energy yet? Right? So the way he presents it, there are 4 different perspectives we have to look at why that hasn't been solved. And nicely, they all line up with the letter I in front, so the 4 I's of information security, or the 4 I's framework. Perspective number 1 is incentives. We'll go into each one of these in a second. Perspective number 2 is ignorance, or information, investments, and irrationality. So my thesis and my proposition to this community is that we start thinking about security problems in the context of these perspectives, right? Why isn't security working? So anyway, let's dive into these for a second. Incentives. The issue of incentives, we've all brought it up here many, many times. The issue of incentives is that whoever is working a problem is not incentivized, properly incentivized to handle that problem, right? And the examples that were given is that there's a case with a package delivery, FedEx, but it could have been any one of them. And FedEx had an issue where they were they weren't moving packages fast enough through a hub. Well, what did they do? They tried all sorts of things. Things just weren't moving fast enough. So what they realized is that they were paying their workers by the hour. And then it was just taking time. Hey, I'm going to be paid anyway, so why am I going to rush it? When they switched it from you're going to be paid when the job gets done, if you're going to get paid by the output, it moved that much faster, right? I come from a background in sales and sales engineering. Copier sales is the example he used, but I'll expand this to any sort of sales organization. Depending how you organize the commission structure for your company, you're going to get different results. You have a brand new shiny product that you want to sell, but if you don't align the commission structure well enough, your enterprise sales or your existing salespeople, they're incentivized to sell what's going to give them the most quota retirement, right? It might be an older product, and that's an example he used. I like to put here the example that, I'm not sure if you're familiar, that something that happened in Israel with people were concerned about daycare. Like a daycare was concerned about how people were picking up their kids late, right? So what they did was, okay, we're going to penalize you by charging you money for if your kids are to pick up your kids. It backfired. Why did it backfire? Because you monetized the situation, and people said, you know what? My cost to do this is going to be a few dollars extra or shekels extra. I'm fine leaving my kid there. So they actually had a worse problem with more kids being dropped off late or being picked up late. How do you resolve an incentive problem? And it has nothing to do with security, right? Well, you better analyze what the incentive structure is and you adjust. And it might be that you're going to give people a grant on how to resolve the problem. You're going to incentivize with a grant. You might have a negative, a penalty, right? So a negative incentive. We're going to fine you. You might give out bonuses. You might have better rules, etc. But that's the incentive angle. So if a problem isn't being solved, could it be an incentives issue? Number two is a problem of ignorance or information, which I think is a little less harsh, which is at this point in time, the organization or the individual trying to resolve that problem does not have enough information to resolve it. And it might be either as an individual, or it might be an organization or a society. Why haven't we solved teletransportation yet, right? We don't know how to do it, right? No amount of money you throw at it is going to solve it. So it's a matter of information. And the examples that people refer to is that campaigns for preventing sexually transmitted diseases in Africa weren't being as successful. Why? Because when the population didn't understand how it worked. So people were asked, people had the misconception that 50% of people had the impression that the condoms actually carried sexual disease, right? So if people don't understand the problem, it'll be an obstacle to resolving them. I like to say that energy storage, like we're making tremendous progress as a society in how we store energy, but it's not fully formed yet. We're still doing research on it. Coming a little bit closer to home, I'd argue that not knowing how to do proper software, right, is an information problem, right? You don't know how to write better software. The answer is simple. How do you address it? Well, you do education, you do basic research, you do training, you collect better data. Maybe the information issue, the information already exists, but not within your organization. One of the corollaries to the work that Sunil was talking about in terms of the DIE framework, is that the amount of telemetry we can then collect from that environment and apply that telemetry to better understand the data is fascinating. Like I think we can do tons of the predictive analytics or what have you based on some of that data. So that's the information angle. The investment, the other angle might be investments. We know how to solve the problem, we just haven't thrown enough resources at it. And resources might mean anything from money to attention to time. So we were having a conversation, Mark and I, and we were thinking about what is one of the fundamental things behind security, and we kind of both agree that it's economics, right? We have scarce resources that we're trying to deploy efficiently? Well, attention is one of those. Examples, the poverty reduction. Maybe, perhaps we just don't have enough. We know what to do, but programs are not funded well enough. If we want to think about animal cruelty, not to pick on your PETA example, right? But regardless of where you stand, if your people may not be aware that people may be extra concerned with how a pet is treated, but they may not be as concerned with farm animals, right? Depending on what you're trying to maximize for, perhaps you should be more concerned with the farm animals, right? So it's a matter of the information about it is not being passed on around. You're not investing in publicizing that issue. How you address it, increase funding, increase publicity, etc. And then perspective number 4, it's irrationality. You have everything. You have the investments. You have the information. You have the incentives, and it's still not working. Why not? And I think that the concept here is that the system has been designed expecting a level of rationality from humans, which is not realistic, right? We are irrational. We all have our biases, and we'll continue having our biases. No amount of software training, no amount of awareness training is going to change that, right? So we have to acknowledge that and handle that in our systems. And I like to think that the 4 major categories for where our biases fall are too much. We have too much information to process. We don't extract meaning well enough from that information. We have a tendency to act fast, picking up on Kelly's comment on System 1, System 2 yesterday. And then we don't really remember things very well. We have selective memories. I'm sure we can think of numerous examples on the topic. I'm not going to belabor the point. How do you address that? Well, first of all, where possible, you want to make sure people are being rewarded for their rationality. You play to their self-interests, right? But also, and this is fundamental, you have to do environment design. You have to adjust the environment and adjust the process to account for that user, for that user behavior. Perhaps it's adjusting defaults. We were talking yesterday about offering people fewer choices. Well, there's something very common called the paradox of choice. People will make fewer choices. They'll make fewer decisions if they have too many choices. Reduce the amount of choices, right? Adopt checklists. Many of you may have heard of seeing the examples of doctors forgetting medical equipment inside the patient during surgery. These are highly experienced professionals at the top of their game, but they forgot something simple, like because they're human. Well, if you have a checklist to account for that, and if you follow that checklist, that can be a resolution. And then finally, count on second opinions. This is why I love the feeling of community we have. The opinions we have here can be shared, and we can talk. I've learned a lot over the past couple of days. I'm thankful for all of you. So that's perspective 4. One example I like to give is I actually have this poster now, because I don't think that behavior economics might be the answer for everything. I have this poster in my office. It came out a few years ago. Lists all, I think, 185 cognitive biases that people have. It's beautiful, right? When I see that, I also remember this picture. Do people know what this is? Aha. So this is the model for the solar system, for how astral objects behaved before we understood that the world was actually this, right? So the point I'm making is I love behavior economics. I think it helps a lot. It may not be the final answer. I think there's some interesting work about evolutionary psychology that we may be able to bring into this. I'm not sure yet. I don't know. So just to recap, the 4 principles I talked about: the perspective of incentives, ignorance, investment, and irrationality. Very little tying to security so far. So how do we tie this to security? I like to call out there might be a 5th eye, and this is me being a little bit of a rabble-rouser. If we have the incentives, if we have the investment, if we have the information, and if we accounted for the irrationality, right, perhaps there's a 5th eye. Perhaps it's importance, right? And the challenge I face here was aptly summarized by Upton Sinclair. It's difficult to get someone to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding it. So the question I'm asking is it important enough, right? And I don't know, right? There's also, on a more serious note, there's some really nice work that Sasha Romanovsky from RAND presented at WIFE a little while back, basically quantifying the cost of a breach. Not so much in the cost per record, that's a rat hole I'm not going to get into, but it accounted for only 0.4% of annual revenues for the size of organization they did. I'm not saying that what we're doing is not important. I'm saying that senior leadership is placing the content, the information that we provide in a context where, on average, it's 0.4% of their annual revenues. I'm simplifying, of course. So let's take it with a grain of salt, right? Let's position it better. The other thing I want to add is, and it's a conversation we've been having, is I stole the title, Mind the Denominator, from Professor Eric Jardine at Virginia Tech. And it's this notion of, can we actively tell, so this is a new slide, can we actively tell that security is getting worse? That's the narrative in this industry. Security is getting worse, it's getting worse, it's getting worse. I don't know. And I haven't seen data to prove that it is. Because how do you measure crime in the city? You don't measure it by counting absolute numbers. You measure per capita rates, right? We measure breaches by number of records. Sure, we've lost 3 billion, 4 billion. How many records last year? I don't know. Does anybody? 4 billion records last year? Well, how many billion records, how many did we create last year? Are things getting better or worse? We don't know, right? And part of that, my call to action is if we can raise the level of debate in this industry by starting talking more about rates than about counts, right? That's one thing. So the other point I'd make, so this is a chart from some work that he did back in 2015, actually. And what you see here is that even though vulnerability counts were increasing, the data is a little older. Even though the count was increasing, the actual rate was staying constant. Are things getting worse? I don't know, right? The other point is from Daniel Miessler. He's very prolific on social media. He writes a ton of articles. It's fantastic reading. He makes the point that software remains insecure because the benefits of software at the level of security they are still far outweigh the drawbacks. I'm not saying that we should give up and go home, of course not. But what I'm saying is that we have to put our message in context. To bring back to Kelly's point yesterday, we have to communicate risk, not only in a way that people understand, but also aware of what everything else we are dealing with, so that we are not just we're not just complaining, right? The rational economic response might be to ignore something from a security angle because, frankly, for them it's not that important. Anyway, enough. I wanted to give a couple of examples of applying those principles that I spoke about. One of them is on software quality. Do people know what's called the Kober effect in economics, or it's also called the rat effect, depending if you believe the story. But so the story is that the Kober effect is that in colonial India, they were concerned with too many snakes running around, so they put a bounty on snakes. What did people do? Any guesses? They started breeding snakes, right? There's a similar version with the rats in Vietnam that they were collecting rat. They would pay, the French government would pay for rat tails. What did people do? Breed rats, cut off the tail, throw the rat away. Yeah. So it's the notion of perverse incentives. Bringing it back to security, this is an example I picked up from BugCrowd. How does the number of vulnerabilities or the number of findings reported by a traditional penetration test, where the team is either paid where the researchers were either paid by the hour or they were paid by engagement, versus a similar result from a bug bounty. Now, of course, this data is favorable to the organization, but the point stands. How you incentivize people is going to drive the behavior is going to drive their motivation to do something. The other one is on user behavior. How many people have seen this slide, this chart, right? And I know that one of the speakers talked, one of the examples in the game was user error. I'm going to be a bit of a jerk about it and say that I hate this slide. And I tell my kids not to use the word hate. I hate it with all my passion because I don't think that what we call user error actually exists to the prevalence that we do. I think that when a user when a user is doing something that we don't expect, I'm much more likely to think that it's actually our fault as architects and designers to have built in a system that is not resilient to a user making a very human mistake. Your organization should not fall because someone clicked on a link. You should not wire $5 million out on account of an email alone, right? So what this means is people will make mistakes and they have to learn from those mistakes. But I think that this industry takes way too often the easy road of blaming the user, right? Let's design our systems better first before we blame the user. And the examples are phishing, right? Hot states in psychology. It's known that when people are in an excited mood, system 1 versus system 2 again, they'll make foolish decisions. They'll make decisions that, not foolish, but they'll make decisions that maximize the immediate outcome versus the future thinking, hyperbolic discounting. Well, how does that stand against your corporate policy of thou shall not click on links you don't know, right? It's not realistic to expect perfection from users in that sense. By the same token, data handling. People are maybe familiar with the principal agent problem of economics, which is how an agent is going to react, how an agent is going to perform. They might be maximizing their objectives different than you as a principal who hired them expected them to. So they're going to do things for their own benefit. And the example I like to use with data handling is it's 5 p.m. on a Friday and you have to send confidential information out. Are you going to go to the trouble of setting up file sharing and then exchanging keys and on and on and on, or are you just going to send the damn email out, right? Again, we have to account for that. And then finally, ransomware, right? Ransomware is not that much of a problem anymore. It still is, but why is it that we don't have smarter defaults on systems that account for that possibility? Sure, and I cover endpoint security. A lot of the endpoint vendors are doing some of that now, but it's just as easy, and Microsoft did it, and in terms of configuring smart folder access, and hey, we can't make changes there won't propagate, or what have you, or you don't need admin access on a workstation, or if you, okay, we need admin access because, or you don't need to run macros. Oh, we need macros because someone receives macros. Fine, enable macros for that department. Learn how GPOs work and enable that as opposed to allowing it for everybody. Anyway, just wrapping up, what did we do? Just looking back. We saw that things fail for different reasons, right? We saw that what this 4I framework looks like, thinking about things in terms of incentives, information, investment, and irrationality, right? We saw some applicability to information security. Other than my broader comments, but we saw it apply to both software quality and user behavior. And I'll leave you with, again, the 4 I's for what they mean. Here's the link to the organization. They have fantastic tests. Their claim is more to help you lead a more rational life. And after the presentation, come up and talk to me. I'll tell you about something on time of value, the value of your time that literally changed my life. This is a link to a presentation that they did about this framework, and that's it. And as I promised, 24 minutes, 32 seconds. Thank you.